Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is City Talk. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in Sing Sing's electric chair. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage in a trial of the century. The Rosenbergs and their trial was a defining moment in American post-war history, a deeply contentious Rorschach test. The tentative verdict more than 60 years later, Julius guilty as charged, Ethel likely not, put in the electric chair by the testimony of David Greenglass, her brother. To tell the still fascinating and ongoing story of the Rosenbergs, Greenglass, and post-war America is Sam Roberts. Sam has been the Times Urban Affairs correspondent since 2005. He is the host of New York Times Close-Up on NY1, and he's recently published an epilogue, Case Closed, to his 2002 National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, The Brother, the Untold Story of the Rosenberg Case. Indeed, Sam's interviews with David Greenglass and with Morton Sobel, the Rosenbergs' co-conspirator, broke the case. If we have time, we'll also find out what Sam's up to now. Welcome back, Sam.
Thank you, Doug. A pleasure.
Absolutely fascinating, and having grown up with it almost at the same time that you did, it's one
I'm
of
a little bit older than you.
Yeah, 2 months. Thank you. This is a story that keeps giving. It's in the news business. You talk about a story that's ongoing as having legs. This is a millipede. It doesn't stop.
Well, what's so fascinating about this is when I began working on it, I knew it was a story about the trial of the century. And then I learned it was also a story about a dysfunctional family, which made it even more riveting. But after 9/11, it became something else. It became a story that resonates today because it's also about reconciling national security and civil liberties. It's about blind loyalty to a cause. And it's also about singling out a specific group for suspicion. And, you know, then it was about suicide spies. Now it's about suicide bombers. But all of these issues resonate today as they did back 50 or 60 years ago.
Sure, and you have cases now. The Manning case, for example, is going to be tried under the same Espionage Act that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were convicted of and executed for. Okay, give us a little bit of background. How do you get into this story? And in a sense, how do you break this story?
Well, the short version is Julius Rosenberg was a Russian spy. This was a time when the Russians were allies. It was World War II. He was a communist, went to City College, looked at the Depression, said capitalism isn't working. Here was a Jewish boy growing up on the Lower East Side, saw conditions around him, saw anti-Semitism, and then he discovers that his brother-in-law, David Greenglass, married to Julius's wife Ethel, suddenly gets shipped off to Los Alamos, where the Americans are making an atomic bomb. And he says, wow, this is a great opportunity for espionage. So he enlists David to spy for the Russians. David supplies some information, which Julius passes on to the Russians. You can argue about its validity. The one thing it does do for the Russians is confirm better information they're getting from more seasoned, more scientific spies. And then they get caught. Julius and Ethel don't talk. David spills the beans. He tries to protect his wife, who is clearly more culpable than Ethel is. He tries to protect himself. His wife doesn't get prosecuted. He gets away with 10 years, a harsher sentence than he expected, and the Rosenbergs get executed.
And the Rosenberg case really splits certainly the American left, where Sacco and Vanzetti sort of coalesces the American left at that time, this really breaks it apart. And the controversy still resonates to the very day, even though with your work and others, the case seems to be closed. But it's not, because last week you won a court case that's going to open up the drama again.
That's right. It is, as you say, a story that keeps on giving. A couple of years ago, the National Security Archive and some historical associations and I sued the federal government to release the grand jury testimony in the Rosenberg case. Grand jury testimony is almost never released. It is secret. It is there to protect the identity of the witnesses, the sanctity of the grand jury system. But in certain cases, it has been released because judges have said history has a greater claim on this than individual secrecy. The judge in that earlier case agreed to release the testimony for people who were already dead. David Greenglass died last year, and now the judge has agreed to release his testimony. If the government doesn't appeal that decision, and if the National Archives processes that reasonably expeditiously, that testimony will be released, and without prejudging what it will say, I imagine it will show greater conflict between what he told the grand jury and what he ultimately testified to at trial.
Well, and his testimony at trial was really a bombshell, like about what, a week or so before during the trial. When was the bombshell? During the trial.
Well,
but he tells the prosecutors, what, a week before?
Doug, it's very hard to fight your way out of the weeds.
Yeah, I know,
case.
and I reread it, and I'm still in the weeds.
But about a week before the trial, the prosecution realizes it doesn't have enough to convict Ethel. And the reason it wants to convict Ethel is to use her as leverage against Julius.
In a sense, it was a bluff.
It was a bluff. And the most cynical thing about this case is I interviewed Bill Rogers, who was the former Secretary of State, and just before he died. And I said, didn't you get everything you want in this case? You indicted them, you convicted them, you executed them. What went wrong? And he said, Ethel called our bluff, which meant the government was bluffing. It didn't have a case. But they're pressing Ruth Greenglass, David's wife, Ethel's sister-in-law, a week before the trial. Don't you remember anything? Don't you remember anything incriminating against your sister-in-law, Ethel Rosenberg? And finally she says, yeah, I think Ethel typed David's notes. And they said, great, this is terrific. And then they went to David and they said, your wife says that Ethel typed your notes. And David says, well, I'm not going to call my wife a liar. So he gets on the witness stand and says, Ethel typed my notes. Ruth gets on the witness stand and corroborates his testimony. The prosecutor, Irving Sapol, tells the jury that Ethel sat at the typewriter and struck the keys blow by blow against her country. The jury convicts. The judge sentences her to death, and there goes the whole trial. Now, what David told me in an interview was, in fact, he didn't really remember who typed the notes, then or now, and in fact, if he were really pressed, he thought Ruth typed the notes, not Ethel. So the fact is, had he told the truth at trial, the chances are Ethel would not have been convicted.
Okay. This book, you cited many things that this case represented, but the book really is the story not only of the Rosenbergs and the case and the times, but it's a story about a reporter, you in this case. Talk a little bit about how you came to the story, how you reported it, how you got 50 hours worth of interviews from David Greenglass, and how Morton Sobel spills the beans to you.
Well,
talk about it from a reporter's point of view, just briefly.
Well, okay, the very beginning is I'm 6 years old, and my father takes me and my sister to the corner of our block in Brooklyn, Kings Highway and Rockaway Parkway, to see the Rosenberg funeral procession go by. And he says, this is history. This is something I want you to see. Fortunately, I don't think it left too many psychological scars on me. At least I hope not. Jump to 1983, and Ron Radosh and Joyce Milton put out a great book on the Rosenberg case. We write a number of book reviews in the Times saying there's news in this book, and Arthur Gelb, the managing editor of the Times, comes over and says, if there's news, why don't we write a news story?
Right.
It falls on me as the new kid on the block. The first thing I do is call Peter Keyes, who actually covered the trial, and I said, what do I do? He said, you want to find David Greenglass. He got out of jail in 1960. He disappeared. He said, all I want to be is forgotten, changed his name, and virtually vanished. I called Roy Cohn, who was one of the prosecutors, and he said, the smoking gun is the testimony of David Greenglass. Well, I spent the next couple of years trying to find him, nudging him, trying to get him to talk, finally did, and in the course of these interviews, he revealed that information that he lied about the single most incriminating piece of evidence about his sister. And if he had told the truth again, the chances are she would not have been convicted, or certainly would not have been given the death penalty. And when you look back at that case, regardless of any other evidence, she was certainly much more valuable to the Russians as a martyr than she ever was as a spy. And then in the course of following up on this case, I was interviewing Morton Sobel, who was a co-defendant, not involved in atomic espionage, but involved in industrial espionage. And I had followed up with him over the years, and he mentioned to me in the course of one conversation that he reached out to one of the witnesses who had testified against him. And I said, why that? And he said, well, you know, I'm 90 years old now, sort of let bygones be bygones. And I said, Mort, the next thing you're going to tell me is, you know, that you were a spy. And Mort said, well, I would put it in those words. And then he begins to tell me that he was a spy, that Julius Rosenberg was a spy, and here he admits the whole thing.
Wait a second, you're sitting there. What's going through your mind at this moment?
I am incredulous that after all these years of lying to his supporters, lying to the public, lying to the Rosenberg family, lying to his family, he now says, yes, I was a spy.
But as a reporter, you know you've got the story.
Well, because I think it's a story that needed to be told about all the people who defended him, thinking he was innocent, all the people he misled, all the people who put themselves out on a limb thinking that he was innocent, the people whose lives were affected by pleading his case. It's a very sad story.
Talking about sad, David Greenglass is a sad story in some ways, but in a lot of ways a really reprehensible, almost amoral person in some sense, even though he had his own sense of ethics vis-a-vis family, etc.
You have to remember, and I'm not holding a brief for him at all, you're talking about little people, ordinary people growing up on the Lower East Side, suddenly being thrust on a world stage. Now, Ethel always wanted to be an actress, and boy, did she get to play the biggest role of anyone's career.
So there's histrionics here?
There certainly were. I mean, maybe it wasn't planned, but boy, did she get to play a great role. David was, as my friend David Halberstam used to say, a schmendrick.
Well, you got to explain the Yiddish. Come on.
He was a narcissist. He was in over his head. He confesses to the FBI. The next morning he gets up and says, I'm going to take it all back. He really didn't know what he was doing. And he never thought, nor did many other people at that point in the case, think this was going to lead 3 years later to a death penalty for his sister and his brother-in-law. So he says, you know, I said, how do you want to be remembered in one of these interviews for the book? And he said, I want to be remembered as a good father, a good son, a good brother, born in a time that tried men's souls. And he said, look, I had to make a choice between my wife and my sister. They had something over me. My wife could have been prosecuted at any time. I hadn't been sentenced yet. And they were holding this over me. The government was holding it over me. He said, I did what any man would have done. I challenge anyone to have done differently. And what I tried to do in the book was put the reader in the place of the protagonist. Not to have a diatribe one way or the other, but to let people put themselves in the place of the protagonist back then and say, what would they have done?
Talk about the 50 hours of interview, all that extensive conversation, in addition to sort of the major aha moment that you've already described. What else was it like just going through this and, in a sense, exploring virgin territory in a case that had been trodden all over?
Well, it was so fascinating because here it was one of the principals who we've never really had before except at the trial itself.
Yep.
And even at the trial itself, Ethel and Julius did not testify. Here is a principal in the case describing what actually happened, growing up on the Lower East Side, being shipped off to Los Alamos, working as a machinist on the atomic bomb, being asked by his wife through his sister and brother-in-law to spy for the Russians, deciding to do it because he was a communist by ideology, and then, becoming disaffected. Part of this also was not just ideology. It was trying to impress his brother-in-law. This was the big city college macher, and David was a lowly machinist, a high school graduate from Harran High School. And this was an opportunity to show his brother-in-law that he was something too. And the dynamic of this, the family dynamic, and the overbearing mother who was siding with the baby brother against the Jewish daughter. The dimensions of this were just fascinating.
Okay, let's talk about the case as a Jewish incident, if you will. All the major principals, at least that I can determine, were Jewish. The judge, Irving Kaufman, is Jewish. Sapol, the prosecutor, and Cohen, the prosecutors, are Jewish. Are there any Jews on the jury?
No Jews on the jury.
Oh, okay.
Now, not
all
that unusual, because remember, the jury, while from New York, is from metropolitan New York.
Right,
This is the Southern District of New York, which includes up into Westchester, Rockland, and the like. You'd think there would have been. The fact is, had there been, they might have been tougher on Jewish defendants than not.
That was just a statement of fact.
And people say, did the judge impose a harsher penalty because he was Jewish? One doesn't know what went through the judge's head. My guess is the judge imposed a harsher penalty not because he was Jewish, but because he was ambitious and wanted to impress the government with the fact that he was
And he
tough.
also wanted to be on the Supreme Court, but
Correct.
there was real opposition. I think Frankfurter said he'd rather die, he wouldn't die to have him become the Chief Justice or a justice.
That's right. And the judge was haunted by that decision for the rest of his life, Judge Kaufman.
Did he ever, in a sense, have a relook that caused him to maybe reinterpret what happened?
Never.
He was totally convinced.
Never.
Always.
And he was guilty, certainly by today's standards. I'm not an expert on standards in 1951 or 1952 or 3. But certainly by today's standards, he was guilty of extrajudicial behavior in seeking from the government surreptitiously what their recommendations were for a penalty and things like that, and sidebar conversations with the government that never would have been tolerated today.
Well, if you look at the already released grand jury testimony, the prosecutors are browbeating witnesses, the grand jurors are attacking
Well, that's what was so fascinating. Apart from what the testimony was in the grand jury testimony that was already released in response to our lawsuit, the grand jurors are saying, well, why aren't you talking? Are you as guilty as the other people?
Right.
Are you, in favor of the Russians dropping a bomb on us? And the prosecutors are saying, what do you need a lawyer for? Do you have something to hide? And, of course, the fact that people have refused to testify before a grand jury or invoking the Fifth Amendment is being used against them.
Yep.
when, of course, it is their constitutional right to do so.
And we talked earlier, opened the show with current meanings, and another current meaning is the problems with grand juries and prosecutors who sometimes go beyond what is professionally required.
That's right, and clearly this, what this shows, regardless of guilt or innocence, and I think, this clearly establishes not that Julius Rosenberg was guilty of stealing the secret to the atomic bomb, because that is worthy of a whole separate debate, but he was guilty of the legal charge that was lodged against him, which was conspiracy to commit espionage. There's no question of that. But it also shows that the government was capable of framing a guilty man.
Ooh, interesting way to phrase it. So, as we open the show, the story isn't closed yet. You've got this new release of grand jury testimony by David Greenglass. You talked a little bit earlier. Give me a hint of what you think might be in there. What could be a nugget, a fact that somehow cast a different light on the story?
Well, I don't want to prejudge, but I would assume there is nothing in the grand jury testimony that refers to Ethel typing David's notes.
Okay.
And I assume there will be more inconsistencies that keep coming up as to dates of meetings, when David was in New York, when he met with Julius, as those inconsistencies keep coming out. Now, you can argue again, those are weeds. The Rosenberg family still says, what about this, what about that? David wasn't there, Julius wasn't here. But again, you can cut through all the weeds and look at the forest, and the forest still says he was guilty of what he was charged.
Well, in fact, when you broke the story of the Sobel admission, a couple of days later, there was the interview with the two sons who had vociferously defended the innocence of their parents. And there seems to be a recognition by the two sons that, in fact, Dad was guilty as charged, and Mom wasn't?
I interviewed Michael not long ago at the Spy Museum in Washington, and Michael raised a lot of questions about my book, raised some factual questions about specific incidents, but yes, he said basically his father was a spy, guilty, he believed, of industrial espionage, military espionage. But one of the things in the military espionage, one of the things he stole was a so-called proximity fuse, which allows a bomb to explode near an airplane. One of the airplanes that it exploded near was the U-2 airplane piloted by Francis Gary Powers in 1960.
Wow.
So forget about the atomic bomb.
Summit. Oh, okay.
Right.
So there were implications. Okay. So the argument has been that it really didn't matter what they actually took, data, information. But in fact it did, and it wasn't the atomic bomb. It was something else.
And if it was the atomic bomb, and if you argue there was no one secret to the atomic bomb, you've got to remember the Russians, Stalin in particular, were even more paranoid than we were, and we all had a right to be paranoid. And they didn't trust their own scientists. They didn't trust their own spies. So the more confirmation they got of what they were getting from other spies, other sources, the more they got from David Greenglass that confirmed what they were getting, made them sure what they had.
Okay, so in a couple of months, perhaps, if there's no appeal, and if there is appeal, several months after that, you're going to come back and tell us, whoops. Is that going to be it?
I hope I'll be able to tell you even more.
Okay. What's next? What are you doing now?
I'm doing another book, inspired by the book that Graham Robb did called Parisians, which was a history of Paris told through a bunch of obscure individuals. This is a book called New Yorkers for Bloomsbury, a 400-year history of New York told through obscure New Yorkers. So if anyone has any characters to nominate, people who were transformative or emblematic of a transformation in New York that we haven't really heard of, please feel free to nominate them.
Well, I've done a couple of nominations.
Indeed. I appreciate that.
And we did this waiting for Governor Cuomo's wake. You going to share any obscure New Yorkers that we should become at least somewhat familiar with before the book comes out?
Well, one of my favorite, I told you, was Elizabeth Jennings, who was waiting for the 3rd Avenue trolley in 1851, thrown off the trolley because she was black, hired a lawyer, Chester Arthur, who became president of the United States, won her case against the 3rd Avenue Trolley Company. They said you can't discriminate against her because she was black, and this is 100 years before Rosa Parks.
Whoa, good one. Another one?
There are a whole bunch of them. John Randall Jr., who laid out the street grid of Manhattan in 1811 when North Street was Houston Street because there was nothing really further north. And he laid out Manhattan up to 151st Street.
And really provided the grid that made New York City.
The grid for development of Manhattan.
You have a lot of fun.
I do have a lot of fun. I try almost as much fun as you do.
Oh, well, we have similar professions. We're paid to read, think,
to learn.
And write, and BS. Come on. Okay, one last thing. What's after that? You always have another project. There's got to be another project.
There is. I want to write a biography of Jimmy Walker, who I think is fascinating. The story has not really been told. He was much, much smarter than he ever had to be. He once said, if I worked full-time, imagine what they had to pay me, because he hardly ever worked. But I think the reason he hardly ever worked is he was so good at what he did.
Oh, this is a real revisionist view of Jimmy Walker. All right, Sam. Okay, thanks to Sam Roberts for joining me today. And his newly released The Brother, The Untold Story of the Rosenberg Case, is a great reminder of significant moment of the 20th century that has resonance into the 21st. Join me next week here on CUNY TV. Excellent, Sam. I loved it. Hello, I'm Doug Musio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.tv. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.